Oh,
So Phil Swift has studied martial arts since he was 8 years old, and he has something over 5 years of experience doing swordplay. He studied under Aaron Miedema and also studied with Jason Easley, and you worked with Jim and also Doug. Is that right?
yes.
Yeah. In 2018, you became a certified instructor for the HEMA Alliance, specializing in Destreza. And what you may not know is that I actually helped write part of your examination. They contacted me to
Oh, it
get you
was you
set up.
pulling the strings.
The thing is, I just know people. Um,
Right. I was wondering how Richard Marsden knew so much about Destreza.
while he was in Michigan, he founded Lansing Community College HEMA Fencing Club and taught Spanish True School Rapier. His move to Newfoundland, am I saying that correctly?
Yes. Yeah, yeah, you got it.
In September of 2018, he reignited the local SCA community and established the Terra Nova School of Swords. Um, he's going to talk to us today about RADA, and that's a good spot for us to hand it off. As you speak, we will try to field questions from the chat window. So if you're part of the audience, go ahead and type questions in the chat. And if we see something that we have questions about personally, the hosts will stop you and ask. All right, you're good to go.
All right. Uh, so hello, everybody. My name is Phil Swift, and I'd like to start off by thanking Sacramento Sword School for inviting me here to let me talk about myself for 90 minutes. And to everyone here who is joining us today. Kidding aside, I'm very honored and I appreciate the fact that we have such an amazing group and community that gets along very well and support each other. So I'm here today to tell you about my journey or my path to how I apply the teachings of Francisco Lorenz Narada into modern HEMA SCA competitive environment. And for a second segment, I'd like to share my pedagogy with you and how I took what little information that was available in English and created a lesson plan in order to teach myself, but to also teach others. That being said, let's start off with why I chose Verdadera Destreza. So my martial arts background is actually in Taekwondo, White Crane Kung Fu, and boxing. My first HEMA mentor was in 2015, Aaron Miedema, taught me Giganti, which is an early 17th century Italian style. So you could say I started off as a vulgar, but I fell in love instantly with Destreza when I first encountered Maestro Puck's and Maestro Martinez's video over YouTube. I fell in love with the aesthetics of the style, the distinctive right angle, the calmness, the elegance, but most importantly, the offline movements. As someone with a boxing background, I tell you, like fighting is all about um, utilizing your angles and footwork. Offline footwork is just something that comes natural to me. So after my move to Michigan, I had loads of time to just work on fencing. We're talking about full time, 8 hours a day. As a Canadian in the States, you're not allowed to work. So fencing was pretty much my full time job. So time wasn't an issue. The problem was that there wasn't much content available in English format at the time. We're talking about 4.5 years ago. And at the time, there was only two books, Puck's Page to Practice and Sebastian's sold out Destreza Historical Fencing. There was a series of lessons available on DVD by Maestro Martinez, but YouTube was a very good source for me. It led me to all of Sebastian's, Puck's, the AEEA, which is Alberto's group, and Tom Poy's videos. However, in pursuit for additional knowledge, I spent hours reading discussions in the sword form and taking notes of interpretations, any translated quotes, or anything that I might find useful. I remember getting so desperate for knowledge that I shamelessly asked and begged Sebastian over email for a copy of his sold out book. I was lucky enough that he sent me his own personal copy. I ended up bugging him with questions through email immediately as soon as I started reading. Yes, I was that shameless. However, this ended up very well for me, as to this day, he still mentors me with videos, messages, and emails. Before we continue, I just want to let you know that I won't be going into much detail about RADA. There's an upcoming speaker who has a greater expertise and knowledge of RADA than I do. Um, and so I'll save much of this for them to cover. Don or Marquise Francisco Lorenz de Rada, who you can see here has many titles. He was a chancellor, governor of Veracruz, a knight of the Order of Santiago, a captain general, which is a very high ranking. And lastly, a marquise, which is a title that was probably purchased. One of his books was burned by the English. However, my focus is on his 3-book series, Nobility of the Sword, which was written in 1705. There's 3 books. The first book just goes through the science and theory of La Verdadera Destreza. The second book introduces fencing terms, shows all the different circles, measures, sword in its degree of strength, the pyramids, the cones. Book 3 has about 113 or so plays. You'll find 43 basic blade plays and offline footwork drills. And then the rest are, which is about 70 atajo drills. So first of all, before I tell you my struggles and experience of adapting and innovating what we learned from text to the SCA or HEMA, I'd like to warn you that if you're self-teaching yourself Destreza because there isn't a teacher around you, or if you haven't realized this already, but LVD has a very steep learning curve. It will almost make you feel like you're fencing at a disadvantage because you're limiting yourself from a lot of the tools and techniques of the game. So think about this for a second. Your opponents can lunge, be explosive, wound in one tempo. Excuse me for my Italian terminology. From time to time, you'll hear this during my lecture. But anyway, they can do extreme body voids like the sotobaru or bata, which is sort of like a crouch passing step lunge, or they can play a refuse style, just placing their sword out of the line, or basically they play the speed game or tempo game. Whereas as the estrix, which is the, I guess, now term for female, male diestro, we can't be in extremes. So we have to stand upright. There's no lunges, except for Rada, but let's not talk about that. We wound in 2 tempi because we play from the binds, which is a more defensive game. But needless to say, you will find yourself disadvantaged in the beginning. And if you can, find an instructor or someone to work with. Otherwise, don't let the steep learning curve discourage you because it'll only get better. Moving on, when I first started working with RADA, I was fencing within the SCA. The SCA has 2 categories of rapier fencing, which is heavy rapier and cut and thrust, or C&T. C&T was considered newish at the time, and it was also in an experimental phase with grappling in the mid, which is where I played. And so as a new fencer, you had to start off in heavy rapier, which means no percussive cutting, no grappling. You can only push or pull cut, and you have to be very careful with those. So that being said, I was very limited, and I didn't realize how much that limited me until later on. However, because of the heavy rapier rules. This made me narrow my focus to working purely on the atajo, disengages, and the first three measures of the bout or exchange.
So,
That
Phil, I
would
have a
be,
question.
yeah,
So you participated in the SCA, and that's a pretty large fencing environment,
yes,
and it can be chaotic. I mean, there are no requirements that you fence in a historical style.
yeah.
What has your experience been in that environment um, as far as results with your form?
Actually, I'm right about to get to that. So, yeah, you know what? I'll continue, and that question will be answered. Is that okay?
Yeah, perfect.
Okay. Um, so I had to concentrate on the first three measures of distance in the bout or exchange, which is the medio proporcional, medio de proporción, medio proporcional, and medio proporcionado of the thrust. This benefited me to focus solely on these fundamentals of blade work and measure distance needed for thrusting. However, I felt like I was missing something in my training. I was missing about 2/3 of my training, as I feel like cutting and grappling or conclusions make up a huge chunk of LVD. Matter of fact, most authors who write about their encounters with LVD practitioners tend to often mention the practitioner using cuts effectively and their distinct right angle stance. So, although it's nice to focus on the fundamentals for thrusting, at the same time, it created bad habits for me to fix when I got into cut and thrust and HEMA, for example. I would miss opportunities to cut and perform conclusions because I would be too focused on trying to thrust. Andre from Montreal actually showed me that my biggest weakness was my close game. I don't train conclusions enough because most rule sets don't allow for conclusions. Now, you could do some form of variation in the SEA, but it's not the same at all. Does that answer that question there?
Yeah, somewhat. We've had some of the other people talk, like in Alberto's lecture, for example. He said that he did not find the historical form to be effective in practical fencing.
Yeah.
So I was wondering if you had any thoughts on that, since he's put that out there. What's your
Yeah.
experience been in practical fencing?
Actually, that's funny because this whole segment is going to be on that. Excuse me. So, uh, yeah, oh yeah, I don't want to give it all out yet, but I'm going to definitely answer that right now.
Good, good.
Okay. Um, oops. All right. So my advice to you is just to find a game or rule set that allows you to train the most out of your system or style that you're learning. For those who do LVD in the SCA, I would suggest you get into cut and thrust because I find that that's truly where LVD shines. So starting off, one of the most difficult challenges, especially for anyone self-learning, is getting the Atajo to work in a competitive environment. The Atajo in theory makes a ton of sense, but practicality, no good fencer will let you get a textbook Atajo on them easily. So actually, I spent a good 2 or 3 years just refining my Atajo. And at first, my Atajos were made with lots of pressure. I was pretty much forcing the Atajo with arm strength. I felt like I was pretty much arm wrestling with all my opponents with swords. Oddly, it worked sometimes because the heavy rapier SCA rule set, it didn't allow them to counter me with a diversion to a Tahoe or Revez. So they would only, I guess they can only disengage from below. They can try to disengage over, but they won't be able to cut a Tahoe or Revez effectively because they have to slow themselves down and then do a push cut or draw cut. But anyway, I didn't realize that I was doing this wrong until I met Jim Lai and Ken Winwell, who is a mod in Alberta. Or no, Edmonton. Jesus, I'm so bad. Um, and so it's not the Tahoe isn't just they taught me that the strength of the atajo actually lies in the structure of your body as a whole, and and not just the strength of your arm. So being behind your sword and having good structure in your stance, like being slightly more squared in the hip orientation, for example, will allow you to put your weight behind your sword with each atajo. So I learned to make my arm movements. I also learned to make my arm movements tighter and smaller when pairing or placing the atajos by applying something that's called Rada's defense pyramid, which is a concept written in Sebastian's book, which, in my opinion, is pretty much a guideline to blade work efficiency. Just making sure that you don't parry too wide or make sure you keep your sword on line at all times. So when placing my atajo, I used to make these wide lateral arm movements. And that was a problem because it opened up an easy disengage shot for my opponents to do on me, right to the forearm. And so I started to make my atajos smaller or tighter by restricting the lateral movements to a general rule recommended by Sebastian in his book, which is roughly 1 foot from the center line. So if you look at the illustration on the left there, where the sword points right in the middle of the circle there, of the base of the cone there. Laterally so that would be the center line. Laterally, I have like a rule for myself that I don't move my tip further out than 1 foot from that center line. I believe Rada's cone of defense is actually smaller than that. Alesh told me it was something like 1.5 feet instead of 2, but I just went with the general rule of 2. It's just a little bit easier to follow, but that's something entirely different. But anyways, I so focus on the atajo because of its importance in the text, and as it is a requirement before doing anything offensively, I ended up being very repetitive and stubborn. So I was so fixated on getting the atajo that I didn't take advantage when I had the atajo. So I remember my mentor, Master Lucien Featherstone, which is Jason Ealy, told me that I was getting really good at binding, but majority of the time I had a chance to wound him, I didn't take it. Because you just kind of get into this habit of just wanting to get the atajo, get the atajo, get the atajo. Right? And so I started forcing myself to use the first intention thrust, or a commitimento. I can't say that word for the life of me. The moment I gained the atajo, or I felt like if they were separating from my bind, like when they're doing a disengage, then I would immediately go for that thrust while they're separating, because that's the advantage of the atajo, is that advantage in time that you get. So if you don't use that advantage, you ended up just wasting that atajo. So to summarize, I got the atajo working for me by limiting my arm movements, making my motions smaller and tighter, I keeping my body or myself behind my sword, relying on the structure and positioning of my body instead of arm strength, and lastly, taking advantage of the moment you gain the atajo.
I have a couple of questions for you before we go on.
Sure.
With your atajo, with the cone that you presented, it looks like the action leads with the tip. Is that correct? That the strong of the weapon is largely stable?
Give me a second. Technically, yes. I guess you would lead with the tip. If the tip is always crossed over the opponent's sword in all the atajo illustrations that Rada shows from above, but you do have they're weak on your fort. But the cone, that cylinder, the pyramid, is made with the fort of your sword. So if you from the wrist, if you that's what that drawing means. But he's making 3 cones of defenses. Well, here's the thing. Sebastian writes cone of defense, and he says it as he says it well. Let me see here. He pretty much says that the pyramids helped the Destro to protect himself. But the problem is this is all summarizing, and he's summarizing things from book 2 and words from book 3. So the pyramids they show in book 2 and book 3. Rada kind of vaguely talks about using the pyramids as a guideline for keeping your opponent's sword out of that pyramid means you're safe. But he doesn't exactly, because the pyramid was originally just used as a way to describe time and space. So he numbers, each section of that pyramid, and that's where he'll tell you to put your quillions or your sword or your arm, essentially.
That's good. The other question I had was, can you give me your working definition of acometamiento?
Oh, okay. So my definition is the first intention thrust. Now here's the thing. In fencing, does your first intention ever hurt somebody or wound the opponent? Only if they're bad. But if they're good, chances are they're gonna parry that first intention. First intention never works in practical fencing if you're fencing someone with some skill. So therefore, I guess you can say it's a feint, but it's a really good feint because obviously, but that's what a feint is it's a good, you know what I mean? Like a really good feint would hit you if you didn't parry. So I get that would be my definition. Commentimento.
Okay, thanks.
Okay.
Phil, I have a question too.
Yeah.
With all of your work with a Tahoe, how did you end up dealing with people who keep their blade refused from you, who don't give you the chance to actually engage their blade at all?
Ooh, I'll get into that as well. I have a whole section on virtual Tahoe, or that's going to be after this one. But yeah, that one's very difficult. But I do have a story for that. Be quite funny as well. But yeah, I'll get right into that in a second. So within the SCA or HEMA, you'll find all kinds of fencers. Right? You got fencers who were ex-modern fencers, to those who just fence a style that they made up, to those who go through other historical sources. Majority of the time, you'll be dealing with an opponent that will be utilizing a lunge or some sort of explosive thrust. If you look at the illustration on the left, you'll see two fencers marked A and B. They're standing roughly 8 feet apart in a measure we call medio de proportion, or defensive measure. And for whatever reason, that proportion, I have to say it in a French accent. That's just the French Canadian in me. But with each ring in between fencers A and B represents 1 foot of space. So if a sword is 4 feet length and both their arms are about 2 feet in length, when they're standing in the right angle extended, you have 2 plus 2 plus 4, which is 8. So in order for fencer A to hit fencer B with a thrust, fencer A must move their front foot into the yellow zone marked with the number 1, which is what we call the offensive measure, or the offensive measure of the thrust, or medio de proporcionado, of the thrust. If these types of opponents are trained to cover distance quickly, then they're very fast and efficient at getting from their defensive measure, which is, let's say they're fencer A. So they're really good at getting from their defensive measure, which is the green, into the yellow very quickly, usually in one step, one tempo. However, in LVD, we are constantly reminded to take caution, and so to wound in Rada's LVD is usually done in 2 steps. So, for example, an ideal play would be if the diestro or diestrix marked as A would take the atajo. In this case, it would be atajo 4, which is on the outside of fencer's A sword. And they would move with a curved step to C, which is the medio proporcional. And then they would wound with a transverse step to K. So just our opponents take one step, we take two. Being able to lunge, our opponents technically have the advantage to cover distance much more quickly. Therefore, I've learned to stay further back from these fencers. So you can say the defensive measure for us districts is where the fight starts, or where we start to perform our techniques. However, against this style of opponent, staying in the defensive measure is like sitting in their kill zone. So my advice is to start being cautious ahead of time. Make sure you start your atajo or virtual atajo the moment or just before you get to the defensive zone. Basically, you need to control the line before you even step into that green. So in a magical world, which everyone is created equally and according to the text ideal measurement, then the total, the defensive measure, from the defensive measure to the offensive measure, so it's from A to 1, there's only a distance of 2 feet. However, this is real life, and you will face opponents with longer arms, longer swords. So for example, let's look at our second illustration here on the right-hand side. Our diestro is B, and our opponent is A. Now, if you look, there's two A's. There's the teal A, and there's the darker A. For whatever reason, I couldn't get it to be lighter blue. So anyways, the teal A is standing where they would be if they were the same proportions. But for this example, we're going to exaggerate things a little bit. A is standing further because they're much taller and therefore have a longer length in their arm. So let's say their arm is about 3 foot length. And then because they're a tall person, they're going to want a very long sword. So let's just say their sword is a total length of 5 feet. So in order for A to thrust B, A only has to cover a 2 foot distance. And for B to thrust A, B has to cover a 4 feet distance. So let's just use our perfect play example that we used previously. In order for B to do a play by the book and thrust A, B is going to want to take the atajo and reach medio proporcional, which is indicated D or C in the previous illustration. That step into medio proporcional is usually a half a foot closer to, gives like pretty much puts them half a foot closer to A at this point. That means B still has to cover 3.5 feet distance in order to thrust A. Even for a lunge, that's pretty long. So never mind a transverse step. So in this case, B may have to take a longer step into medio proporcional. So instead of taking a half a foot step closer to A, B might want to take a deeper step and get about a foot closer to A, or B might have to use more steps from medio proporcional to medio proporcionado. And that means B would have to hold the atajo longer or obtain a second atajo because A is going to probably disengage. So you will either have to add more steps in order to reach A. Main point is you have to play defensive, and so you're going to have to be patient. Now, what I would do in this case against someone with the advantage of reach is I would constantly provoke them to lunge by stepping in and out of their kill zone. And in this example, it would be the defensive measure. So I would move in and out of defensive measure, making sure I at least have the line, otherwise that'd be suicidal. And then I would come in and out, try to get them to jump, to lunge at me, because I'm teasing them, being right in that kill zone, not going anywhere further. And if they do take the bait and lunge or thrust, then they would have saved me 2 feet of distance that I needed to cover. So at this point, I should be at least in medio proporcional. And I can immediately go into offensive after my parry and try to wound in one tempo. So to summarize, start your match as far back as you can and give yourself more time and room to strategize. Is there any questions about the slide before I move on?
I have a question.
Yeah.
So some of the authors, I think it might be Ed Nard who says this. It says that there is no atajo without the right angle. So are you getting an atajo on a bent arm? How are you forming it? Are you drawing the attack, which extends the arm, and then getting the atajo on that?
So, sorry, you're saying Vedma doesn't take the atajo with the bent arm?
Some authors will tell you that without the right angle, the arm extended, there is no atajo.
Yeah, well, in Rada's atajo, he has his hilt pretty much down to his navel, to his belly button.
So
but his arm is straight.
I mean the adversary's arm. So if the adversary's arm is not extended,
Oh, okay. I see what you mean.
right angle is not possible. So I was curious about how you're getting a atajo on adversaries if their arm's not extended, or if you're drawing the atajo, or if you're drawing an attack to get their arm to come out.
I guess, like, in the case that I'm dealing with someone like that, and I'm going in and out of their kill zone, I guess you would say I'd be doing more of a virtual atajo or an atajo that's touching, but I wouldn't say it's a good atajo, like, because for me, good atajo is when you get an atajo at medio proporcional, because at that point, when they disengage, they have to move around your quillions. When you're taking a atajo further than that, they don't have to move away from your quillion. But to me, at the same time, you're still doing what an atajo does, just not well. So meaning you're still positioning your sword so that your opponent can't complete a simple attack on you.
Sure, that's good. I think that answers my question.
Yeah. Call it a gain if you want, Mas. But like I said, it's not a good atajo. But I'm at least covering myself and making sure that I'm not giving them an easy shot. But okay, so let's see here. Okay, so at the time, there was a time where I wanted to be more vulgar offensively, and I wanted to be explosive. So I wanted to use transversals or transverse like they were lunges. I wanted to make them deeper, faster. I have the athletic ability to do it, so like, why not? Why not use my speed? Try to make my destreza more explosive, more punchy. But that was the problem. I was pretty much trying to play them at their own game. So I was trying to play that thrust tempo game. Instead, but you see, that is the problem. We should get them to play our game. And so I needed to learn patience. Now, within the SCAdian HEMA, our science is always, is being tested to the extreme. So we have to fence a variety of opponents. And within that variety, there are those who refuse the blade, those who are very fast at disengaging, and they won't let you even get the bind. So our answer to that problem is the virtual atajo. Pretty much an atajo, a way of impeding them from hitting you in one tempo, let's say, but without touching their blade. It's pretty much like the Italian concept of counter guards, according to Fabrice, if you read that. But which is to prevent your opponent from striking via the shortest path without, but for us it'll be without contacts of blades. So at first, what I did wrong was I would pretty much walk up to my opponents in what I call an Italian iron door, because I thought, I believe the book says, I'm not 100% sure because I am reading a summarized version, but you essentially imagine your opponent standing in a right angle stance, and I place my guard as if I was going for one of the first four Tahoe. That doesn't work because that made it easier for them to gain my weak in their extension. And plus, it's a stance that they're very used to fighting against. Basically, how most people in the SCA get trained at first is that stance, is the iron door, as their on guard stance even. So these opponents are very used to fighting against that stance. So it doesn't really work on them. My mentors, Jim Lai and Arik Mendelevitz, sorry, I'm butchering that last name, told me instead to point at their elbow or hand, basically placing your sword somewhere to intercept them or hit them as they extend to right angle. So if they have their hand low or hand down, they're going to have to extend that hand into the right angle just to hit you. So you want to place your sword somewhere in that area so that when they extend, hopefully you can get their arm. Now, this did work slightly better for me. However, to this day, I still have difficulties with refuse guards. I did have one of the best gunslingers in the Midwest defense against, which is Master Lucien. So, and he's like 6'4", so he's got a lot of reach on me. So I had a lot of time working with virtual Tahoes with him. But regardless, he still rocked my world. So it's very difficult to get it working well, but it is possible. After my trip to Italy, I actually had the chance to get owned by Maestro Francisco Loda and fence with some of Team Italy before their competition in Minsk. I realized that there's a lot more that I needed to work on to give myself some competitive edge. So because Destreza is not an explosive style, meaning you can't rely on fast lunges to gain the element of surprise. So before COVID, at the Swift Lab, I was working on rhythm. I believe that you can still gain advantages of surprise using rhythm. Like for example, if you get your opponent used to a certain speed, passiveness, or pattern of movements, then all of a sudden you change moving faster or being more aggressive or changing the patterns or your patterns, then your opponents will be caught by the element of surprise, thus giving you somewhat of the same advantage as if you were explosive. Does anyone have any questions with that slide? Or moving on. Now with everything said, please keep in mind that what works for me may not work for you. Everyone is different, and so you need to tailor your style towards your advantages. For example, my student who's almost 7 feet tall will be playing a totally different game than I would. He might not want to concentrate on pressuring his opponents with the Tahos like I would, but instead he might want to play towards his advantage of reach or the advantage of the right angle, meaning he might want to utilize disengaging and footwork to let his opponents stab themselves when they try to close in on measure. So my advice to everyone is to build your decision tree. Sit down, analyze your approaches, figure out what you want to do in first intention, then imagine how your opponents will react to your A, B, or C. And then think of how you will deal with their reaction to A, B, or C. And then this way you can create muscle memory. And the less thinking you have to do in the middle of the bout, the faster you will fence. So more importantly, Fence as many opponents as you can. Fence as many opponents with every possible style. Even if you lose 100 times, go and fence 100 more opponents. Because you don't learn when you win, you learn when you lose. And every opponent is like a puzzle that I need to solve. So don't give up. Once again, you've chosen a very difficult but rewarding path to study Destreza. It took me 3 to 4 years before I even started winning bouts and exchanges. So this concludes my first section of this lecture. Are there any questions?
I don't have a question, Phil, but I do have a comment on this, which comes from the founder. So when Carranza talks about teaching students, he compares each student to a musical instrument, and every instrument is going to be different. So when he talks about training a student, he says that you tune the instrument to itself, not to some external thing, and that's the only way that the student will be able to create music, or you have to harmonize with your own self. And it lines up perfectly with what you're saying. I'll see if I can find the quote, and
Yeah.
I'll send it out your way.
I might have to steal that. That is great. All right. So in this second segment, I'd like to share to you my pedagogy, or how I took what little information that was available at that time in English and created a lesson plan to help to teach myself, but to also teach others. So first thing you got to do is basically decide where you stand within the historical or modern sport fencing spectrum. For myself, I decided that I wanted to teach a version of LVD that would be practical within the SCA HEMA competitive environment. But also keeping in mind that when I teach LVD, I try to decrease the barrier of entry by de-jargonizing information. This means I need to keep my terminology simple, easy to remember, and mostly in English, except for certain words that you can't translate, like the atajo, for instance. Keep in mind that for this presentation, I will use the correct Spanish terminology to the best of my ability. However, for my students, I will use terms that are more easily understood in English. I've chosen a certain pace of information delivery that caters to my students. So choose a pace that caters to your group. I'm trying to do this full time, so I'm trying to keep my students. So therefore, I have to really cater to them. Students that usually come in my class, they want to jump in, start swinging swords. So I have to satisfy that in a sense, but to also make sure they're going to do that safely. But I have to make sure my students are being challenged, but at the same time having fun to keep their interest and to keep them from coming back. So I sat down, wrote out learning objectives. What's my end goal? What do I want my students to leave with after they're finished their program? And now that I have an idea for learning objectives, how do I build them up to this? So I started breaking everything down to the fundamentals. So my objective in the first introduction lessons is to build their foundation and get them prepped for the first phase of a bout, which is the first intention. And so they will need to learn how a distance and So they need to learn grip, stance, footwork, lunge, and the forehand position. Yes, I said lunge, because I'm teaching them how to lunge and recover for the purpose of understanding the technique itself. Getting them used to seeing and responding to lunges is basically like what Sun Tzu said. Know your enemy. To know your enemy, you must become your enemy. And so why did I this so that's why I decided to teach them lunges in the beginning. But as they progress, I will give them the tools they need to substitute the lunge or to leave it out entirely. Plus, Rada teaches the lunge, so I can say we're doing Rada, but he does say that he only like he probably just threw it in there just because he's like, yes, you could lunge, but you know, there's other things you can do. Once they have so after I teach them how to lunge, teach them how to recover, that's when I go into lateral parry. So teach them how to wound. Now I'm going to give them a response to that wounding action. So I'll get them to lateral parry stationary first. And then once they have lunges, lateral parry, and disengaging down, I start teaching them to, I start getting them into offline footwork. So I start off by teaching them curve steps, just in isolation, curve steps by itself. And then I get my students to put that into play. So to make those lateral steps, to make the curve steps with the lateral parries. And then they will start to notice the advantage of offline footwork. After the intro lessons, I start to get deeper into the science by going over offensive measures and the first vertical plane, or in simple terms, I call the line. And we work on transverse steps. And this is where we start to work on transverse steps from the defensive measure to the offensive measure. Instead of thrusting. So this is where I get them to substitute the lunge with transverse steps. This is also where I start to explain degrees of force, and I start them on transferring drills. And afterwards, we go into discussion about body orientation. So squaring to gain advantage of strength in your structure, and profiling to gain the advantage of reach.
All right, so I have a couple of questions. Sorry to jump in on that.
Yes, sure, yeah.
Can you define transferring for me?
Yeah, so if someone has the advantage in the bind, so they have your weak, in order for you to gain the advantage of the bind, you use something called transferring. So you would instead take your weak, or you would place your strong on their weak, sliding up their blade. And then once you have their weak on your strong, you pretty much you put the weight of your sword on it, or you take it over, you take the line over. That way their tip points out of your cone of defense.
So the action of the movement of increase is to increase degrees of strength in the bind. Are you tying that to transferido as a concept, or?
Yes.
Okay.
So I teach them movements of increase and decrease, and then transferring from when, so that's when they apply these movements of increase and decrease, is in the transferring.
Okay, and I wanted you to go into a little more detail on personal planes and body orientation in the Ataho.
Yeah, sure. So Rada, like what I've heard from Phil, when he takes the Ataho moving toward, so if he's on the outside of the sword, moving towards the outside of the sword, so moving towards the left, he will tend to square his body up for structure, because you're using structure, the advantage of or strength against their advantage of weak, because when you move to their right side, they're technically gaining the advantage of reach, whereas you're losing the advantage of reach. So instead, you're gonna use the advantage of strength to counter the advantage of reach, and vice versa the other way. And so when you square your shoulders off, it's harder to move. It's harder to move your blade offline if they're trying to go force with force. Does that answer that question for you?
I think so.
Okay.
Is this an Is this an onset or is it a reaction?
Sorry, English is a second language. What does onset mean?
So would this be something you'd be doing to take initiative? I'm not familiar with the system so much.
Oh, okay.
Or would this be a reaction, right? Because, it seems like a pretty fundamental action, so I'm wondering if it's tied to, a specific setup.
I believe it's tied to, it's just their science or their way of thinking.
Okay, understood.
wanna
So it's a core concept.
Yeah, yeah. Okay, moving on. So basically, showing it. Okay. Right. So basically, I'm teaching them transverse steps, movements of increase and decrease, transferring, body orientation. All of this is presets, ties them into learning the Ataho 1 to 4. Because in order for you to perform an Ataho, you need to know where the medio proporcional is. And you would take the Ataho, move over with the curve step to the medio proporcional. So this is when you're utilizing your curve step. And then you would then utilize your transverse steps. So you're putting everything together here. And for a while, they're going to spend a lot of time with drills working just on controlling the plane or the line. So after teaching them the Ataho and how to control the line, I teach them how to respond to the Ataho. So for situations when their opponent has the Ataho on them, what do? So they learn to use diversion and offend with a Taho or revés, or to disengage from below and offend with a thrust or a cut when the opponent has the Ataho on them. Now, as you can see here, I'm slowly showing them a decision tree or a sequence. So first get the Ataho. If the opponent does nothing, you stab them. If they respond with diversion or disengaging, then you're going to need to answer that with your response. This is where we get into second intention. So I teach them to respond with Ataho, to regain the Ataho again if they use diversion and try to cut. So you'll parry with an Ataho, now you have Taho, then you go for your thrust. Or if they disengage from below, then I train them to use spirals, like inclusion, which is sort of like your narrowing or stress jar, or line and cross. So inclusion would be a counterclockwise spiral. Line and cross would be a spiral going clockwise. Finishing off the beginners program, I give them a few more tools to use. I give them a few more tools to use for the first intention, like suspension or what I call a beat. And I give them a few more responses to the Ataho, like a medio Taho or a medio revés with a disengage from above. So this concludes my beginners program. Students leaving with this program should have the tools they needed to create a first intention, react to one, and then somewhat create a second intention. For my intermediate program, my goal is to give them the tools to be able to build their own decision tree, work on critical thinking, and at the same time provide them more tools to work or experiment with. So for the decision tree process, for example, we get them starting working on the decision tree making process together. And we start off first by drilling first intention and responses based on the opponent's reaction. For example, gain the Ataho, opponent doesn't move, stab them. Gain the atajo, opponent does transfer or transferido to regain the atajo. Then you would disengage from below and thrust with a transfer step. You gain the atajo, the opponent disengages under, then you regain the atajo, or you use inclusion or lining across and thrust with a transfer. This is actually a drill that Jim Lai created, and he does it with blindfolded as well, so you work on tactile. And then this leads me to my next drill, which is a more response-based drill on pressure. So, for example, in pairs, a student would perform an atajo with little, medium, or heavy pressure. Rada has this drill too, but he goes into some really extremes. He has like, I think, 4 or 5 different degrees of pressure. I can't remember right now, but I broke it down to 3. There's just little, medium, heavy. So if a student put an atajo on me and it's a little, like it's very little pressure, then I'll just regain it with transferido into an atajo. Now, if they give me medium pressure, I might disengage with a medio atajo or a medio revés, depending on which side the pressure is on. Now, if they give me heavy pressure, then I'll rather use diversion with tajo or revés. So afterwards, we would build on this until we get to 3rd or 4th intention, and this becomes an everyday drill for them afterwards. So it's like sort of playing chess with the tools that you were given. And this kind of helps them with muscle memory and building their decision tree.
So with your tajo and revés, those are forehand cuts and backhand cuts. Are those into the adversary's weapon so that you regain the bind, or are they into the adversary?
Oh, okay. So like if my opponent gives me heavy pressure, then I'll use diversion with a tajo and revés. That would be straight to their face.
Okay, thank you.
Let's see. What happens if my opponent is a vulgar or is doing something that you're not used to? So this is where I prep them for critical thinking. And we give them some real world simulation so that they can work on the virtual atajo and get a feel for fencing different styles. So this is usually where we do coach matches and everyone's analyzing the exchange. At some point, I'm going to use my Giganti and try to fence them as a full Italian to just give them an example of what their opponent will be. Now, granted, our SCA community is super small here. It's literally like 5 or 6 people. And we're stuck on an island and we can't go anywhere unless you want to spend lots of money to fly out. So I have to be their opponent and I have to mimic all the styles that I've seen. So I'll watch a lot of Black Tiger and try to mimic that style and give them a taste of a really crappy Black Tiger fencer. But so this is a way for me to kind of to get them ready for their opponents. I want to simulate their opponents so they get used to this. Otherwise, when they go to tournaments and they fence people who fence totally different styles, they're not going to know what to do. So at this point,
so I just want to say that as another fencing instructor, it's really nice to hear you taking on the role of the bad fencer and making sure your students do the right thing.
Thank you.
Hey, yeah. Some of us don't have a choice with that. We just are bad fencers.
So at this point, I start giving them, for the experimenting phase, I start giving them things that I may not be good at, but they're still things that are taught in the book. And the thing is, I may not be good at them because I might not be, because I can't get them to work in the practical world. But that doesn't mean I shouldn't teach them this. So at some point, I'll give them the tools to work with, like a tajo 5 to 8, which I like to call second intention atajos, because there are atajos that you would use if 1 and 4 didn't work. And I call this experiment because I have yet, like I said, I have yet to utilize a Tahoe 5 to 8 in the practical world. But that doesn't mean, I shouldn't teach them. Because it might not work for me, but it could easily work for somebody else.
So just to bring everybody along for the ride, can you explicitly spell out the difference between a Tahoe's 1 to 4 and 5 to 8?
Okay, so a Tahoe 1 would be if I gained you from the inside, and I move towards. Oh, look, the slide is there. So if you're B, I'm A, I take your inside, I move to D. That's a Tahoe 1. A Tahoe 2 would be we're on the outside, and I move to D with my sword on top of yours, creating an angle. And that would be a Tahoe 2. A Tahoe 3 would be if we're engaged on the inside, and I move to C, and that would be a Tahoe 3. A Tahoe 4 would be if I have your outside, and then I move to C. Now, this is a Tahoe 5 is essentially a Tahoe 1, but your opponent decided to disengage from under. So you have you're standing, so you're engaged in the inside. You move to D, they disengage, and when they're disengaging, you do what Tim likes to call an un-ataho, which is an ataho from underneath. And then that would be 5. 8, and then 6 would be if I had a Tahoe 2. So we were engaged on the outside. I move to D, you disengage. I follow your disengage, and I place my sword underneath your sword, forming the Ataho from below. And vice versa with 7 and 8. They're just 3 and 4, but if they disengage, you follow that disengage. So if they disengage counterclockwise, you follow it counterclockwise. Does that answer your question?
It does. I wasn't sure that everybody knew Radha's 8, so I wanted to make sure we brought everybody along.
Okay. Yeah, I wish I did take a picture of. Yeah, okay. There is a picture right there. So that's the Ataho from below. So I believe the Diestro is A, which is on the right side, and he's sort of got his opponent's weak on his fort there, right in the middle. It's probably like, anyways, and he's underneath the opponent's sword. And you want to bring your hilt up to your face so that when they disengage, at this point they have to disengage over your blade. When they disengage over your blade, they don't stab you in the face. So that's why you need to make sure you lift that hilt up. I believe my mentor Jim Lai is starting to get the Ataho 5 to 8 to work. To be honest, I'd rather just do inclusion or line and cross. I just find that a little bit more effective. But then again, I haven't tried it enough for me to fully say that it's not effective. And, nor would I ever really say that. But just not effective for me. So, this is when I start giving them the advanced tools. So again, this is still the experimental phase. Now, in this section, I start to break down general techniques by Atahos 1 to 4. So I break down all the Atahos. Which technique can you do from Ataho 1? Which techniques can you do from Ataho 2? So on and so forth. This is where we start dissecting all the general techniques and what options we have from each Ataho, essentially. So like what Maestro Alberto said last week, it is very difficult to execute these general techniques practically in modern HEMA or SCA. So that's why I'm calling it experiment, just like Ataho 5 and 8. So this is where we learn ways to try to apply these techniques into practical fencing, or break down the techniques and work on the motions for these techniques individually. Maybe you can find something there that you can use instead of finishing the full technique, for example. But also in this section, we go through multiple interpretations from different practitioners and authors as well. So for example, I will go through Sebastian's interpretation of the general techniques. I will also mainly go through Tom Poy's interpretation of these techniques for Rada. And I'll go through Puck's interpretation for Pacheco as well with these techniques. Maybe there was something there that might work better for us. So we go through all of the interpretations that I can physically find. And so this is what we do at the Swift Labs, I guess. Lastly, we have conclusions. Ultimately, I think conclusions are very important, especially with my exchange with Andre from Montreal. I realized how effective conclusions are, and it should be taught way before all this experimental stuff. But it's just the fact that conclusions isn't something we can do legally in all the rule sets. So this is something I've saved for last. But that doesn't mean it's not important. I think it's very, very, very important. But anyways, to sum it up, the strategy behind my program or my syllabus is to give my students all the tools they need to be able to break down the phases of an assault, analyze their opponents, and formulate strategies. Ultimately, my goal is to prepare them for SCA HEMA competitive combat while still keeping the age in historical as best as we can. So above all else, I like to remind everybody that we are very lucky for such an amazing community, and don't be afraid to reach out. I've found that I've learned the most when discussing my doubts with others in the field. And I wouldn't be the fencer I am today without the connections I've made within the community. So be shameless. Ask as much as you can. A lot of people are willing to give you this information. There's just some of us are just dying to be bothered. Maybe not Puck because he's got lots of kids, but but you can ask me. So I also want to give a huge shout out to I think it's Alan or Alan. Can't say your last name. Sorry, really bad with last names. But he's been doing some really good job with translating Rada and working with Alesh as well. And I wish they were there for me like 3 years ago, but that's fine. I just had to go through a lot of weeding out what didn't make sense and what does. So thank you, everybody. Muchas gracias. And I do have a YouTube channel, which I'm shamelessly going to promote. Right now in Swift Labs, we're working on Matthew Howden's Frias, and I was working on Morello as well. So you'll see a lot of Destreza Saber videos. Thanks to this talk, I was able to start looking back into my Rada notes. So that was nice. Thank you for making me do this. If there's any questions, I'd definitely love to answer them now.
All right. So we have about 30 people on the call. It could get crazy really quickly if everybody just starts talking. So let's put the questions into the chat, and then Eric and I will moderate, and we'll ask those questions to Phil.
Sure.
So nobody has typed in a question successfully yet. So you've been using the term inclusion. Can you tell me what that? Can you define that for me? Okay, we have a question from the chat. What has been your experience working with students of different body types?
Yeah, that's well, so far, it's so far I haven't worked with the only time I had women students was in Michigan. I only have like one woman student recently, and she hasn't been showing up. Well, before COVID. And the thing about working with the opposite sex is they're anatomy wise they're differently, and so I find that some female fencers they find it hard for them to do the right angle in their feet, so it's harder for them to have their back foot fully uh, straight out and their front foot pointing at their opponent. So some ladies, I'll be okay. I'm a stickler for footwork. Like if you're my student, like I call people on footwork all the time. Crazy about that. But essentially, I will allow some of my women students to kind of be like this instead of the right angle. So if it's easier on their hips and easier for them. Hopefully that answers that question there.
Yeah, Phil, we had another question. What's the time frames that your students typically take to get through the various beginner, intermediate, advanced
So
programs that you have?
I want to say generally a year to year and a half or two, just because in Michigan I was able to do 2 classes a week, and so a lot of them passed their beginner's exam within a school semester. Some of them took 2 semesters, so a full year. But that's like the slowest, and that's 2 times a week, 2 hours. Sorry, 4 hours total a week. Now they're only doing 2 hours a week because of space costs. And it's quite expensive for me to book when I only have 16 or so students.
Right.
And so recently, I have a couple students who passed their beginners program, but that's after about 6 months. They haven't. There's no one that has passed the intermediate program yet. 2 of them are currently in the intermediate program as of now. I did have some intermediate students in Michigan, but I had moved before they finished the program. So sadly, I don't have the answer for how long the intermediate program would take. But the test for the intermediate program is much more harder than the test for the beginners program, because the beginners program, I just want them to know how to do fencing. And I just want, and so the intermediate program for them to pass that's when I start getting into Destreza, because I know that at that point, if you're my student for that long, then you want to know the terms. You want to take a deep dive. So that's when I'll truly test them. Whereas students who are just jumping in, and I'm not going to go crazy in terms and science with them. I'm just going to let them hit stuff until they're ready to move on to that next level of seriousness.
Right. I have another question. You said you're starting to work with some saber from Moreau and Frias. So how are you seeing this either merge or be distinct from what you've studied through RADA and the systems you've put together on your own? Do you see elements like coming together, or are you going to borrow from one and apply it to the other? How are you working on that? Or are you just doing it just by the authors as they presented it?
I do. I actually helped me a lot with Frias. Actually, Frias was very hard for me because English is still my second language. So reading translated English, and Matthew Howden is amazing for that. I like a translator that translates kind of words for words and then leave their biases out of it, because then you, as the person interpreting, you can make up you have the raw data, I guess, to work with, and I prefer that. But I find that Morello was very, very easy to read and learn. It was super easy, but it was made for cadets, so it was made for Army guys. I'm not saying anything bad about that. I'm just saying that it was made for Army guys. So it was made easier for beginning and infantry level. And anyways, it was made easy to read. And whereas Friaz is very difficult to read. However, he does use more of the older terminology, whereas Morello kind of uses more newer terms. And Jake kind of translated over the terms, so then you don't know what the original is unless you bring up the PDF and kind of read through that. So it was but the funny thing was Morello gives you these hints that he's doing a transverse step, but never shows you one. So if I didn't know Rada, then I wouldn't have been able to figure that out. But again, I could be biased. So, yeah. But ultimately, it does. Friaz and Morello is much easier, mainly because it's available to read. But it's written later on, so it's a little bit easier to translate, I assume, compared to Rada, right?
Mm-hmm.
So I think we've been breaking the ice because there's a lot more questions going on in the chat. So I've got a collection of stuff here, and maybe Eric and I can tag team some of this.
Sure.
So one of the questions is, would withdrawing and rethrusting be more effective, do you think, than trying a simple disengagement? And
Wait,
yeah.
sorry, say that one more time.
So this is a technique which apparently is German, called Nachreißen, and it's withdrawing and rethrusting. I think in Destreza, Pacheco calls it out as
punching thrust.
The punching thrust, yeah, or the
punching thrust, yes.
Yeah, it's better than what we originally translated it.
Nachreisen is the traveling after. It's when you follow after somebody who has voided. Yeah, so somebody throws. Yeah, when you throw an Oberhau, this is the easiest example, but it's applicable to everything. And anyways, when you throw an Oberhau, if you void that, suddenly somebody has an opening where they just threw from. You can apply that to when somebody switches guards to thrusts.
Right.
Exactly right.
Okay.
That's what we've been traveling after.
Yeah, because we've been doing going through some Meyer, and that's how the instructor described it. Is they come at you and you can withdraw, and that gives you an opening to come forward again. But that was really the only context we talked about it at that time.
Okay, so you're seeing a punch. What about the punching thrust there, Puck?
Well, they wanted to know if you think that would be more effective than a simple disengagement.
So rather than doing the spiraling, trying to get a Tahoe and disengage, is it more effective to withdraw and then come back? Or are you just opening yourself up to get thrust into the face?
So the funny thing is, in theory, I think it's more effective to spiral and disengage out. Because defensively, when you leave your sword out like that, you have your cone of defense is bigger than if you were to withdraw, and so they can take advantage of that tempo and hurt you. You're just more defended when your sword and huge cup Taza health is out there. Yeah, and so I the safe way to I would rather do the disengage and leave my buckler out there. Rather than do the punching thrust, but practically the punching thrust might seem more deceiving to the eye because it's sort of like a jab, which is harder for the eye to kind of follow versus something like this.
Right.
So, as much as I want to say science wins,
right.
The truth is, you're deceiving the eye.
And if you don't mind me weighing in, the punching thrust, it sounds like it actually fits the definition of the Nachreisen a lot better than the disengage.
Right. No, thank you. That's just a question that came into my mind while we were talking about stuff.
Okay, we got some more questions here. So, what have you had to modify or add to Destreza for SCA fighting or open play? Let's make it a little more general.
Okay, so I do try to keep everything. I do try to I really do try to stay within the age. But the problem is I don't have the full text translated, so I can't follow the book like it's a Bible, which works out, I guess, for me. But until that happens, then great. But until then, I have a little bit of flexibility. But I guess the main thing that I take from, I guess, my other martial arts, and I guess because sport fencers do this too, but I only knew this later, is that I do a lot of heel. Well, in my footwork, it's always heel toe or heel ball of the feet. So my steps, for instance, curve step to the left when I'm moving with the left first. My heel would land first, and then the ball of my feet. So I have a lot of these smoothing out footwork stuff that will make your head bop less, which eliminates tells, stuff like that. But other than that, I mean, I lunch like I'm still an Italian at heart, so if I have the chance, I'm gonna do it. If you give it to me, I will do it. But I mean, I'll try not to at first.
I
But-
should introduce you to Pacheco's pathways because I think it's going to allow you a little more flexibility in your attacking paths.
Oh, cool. Okay.
So I'll
Yeah.
I'll put something up about that. But some of those pathways are straight. It's just not as common.
I'd like that.
Yeah. So we got a couple more questions here.
Yeah.
Games for beginner fencers, just smack stuff games that you have to make it fun for beginners who are learning. What have you had? What have you got?
Mm. Uh, Reaction games. You know, if I have a bunch of gloves and I throw it at you, you gotta try to pick it up. Um, I have games where you bounce the ball, you try to catch it, and you're increase movement. You're moving forward. Uh, but I don't do it the lunging way, though you could do it the lunging way if you want. Don't shame me for lunges. Rada said you could do it. I'll use Bella Española. I've been experimenting that a lot as a way to disengage out of measure, as a slip, as one would call it in saber. But anyway, so aside from that, a lot of hand-eye coordination games. Like I'll throw a ball up in the air, try to thrust that ball with your tip. That's really hard. Not a lot of people can get that, but nonetheless, it's ways to just build your hand-eye coordination.
That's really that's good. So another question: what is your favorite piece of Destreza trash talk or smack talk from the old masters? Oh, did we lose you? We may have lost Phil. Phil, can you hear us? The cold shoulder. Yeah.
Looks like the internet kicked me off for being a vulgar. So
Yeah. Yeah, we didn't boot you out of the meeting for lunging, although we probably should have. So, what was the your favorite Destreza bit of trash talk or trolling? That was where we were.
Oh, I can't stand trying to read Pacheco. Like he is definitely the godfather of trolling. I thought Silver was bad. I mean, Silver is pretty bad, but I think Pacheco is right up there, if not better, than Silver at trash talking.
Silver only wrote 100 pages.
Yeah, yeah, fair enough. Pacheco does it poetically, so more poetically than Silver. He does it with style.
So I think that's most of our questions, and I just wanted to say I found your path through this. The difficulty of synthesizing a lot of different sources into a coherent system and putting that together, learning to like the challenges that you face trying to make that system work, and finally realizing something that was practical. I think that was really interesting, and I think it was really valuable to hear about it. Eric, did you have anything to add?
And I really appreciated hearing your whole process of developing through this and working to develop a whole program for your students. That was really impressive. A lot of really good information. I'd like to really hear more later on of how you integrate more of the new Sabre material with your other material for the school.
Awesome. Yeah, I'd love to talk about that. So that's I'm falling in love with Sabre only because the sources are there and something I can kind of dig deep into. Until Alan starts translating all of Rada, then that's gonna be my next my next project, I guess.
All right. Well, thank you so much for speaking to us tonight. And I should take a moment and let everybody know who our next speaker is. That is Alex Basoulis Vindrell, and he's one of the RADA specialists from Europe. So he's going to talk about RADA for us. So I hope everybody has a good evening and stay safe. We couldn't do these without the community agreeing to do the lectures and for our speakers giving their time and expertise. Really what this does is it brings us all together. We don't always have to agree about everything, but we can share what we know and have these discussions and really bring the community together as a whole. So thanks everybody, and I hope you have a good evening.
Bye. Take care.